Hello and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
Today we're continuing our series on the Poetic Edda with Hymiskvida, or the fetching of the Cauldron. Literally, this is Hymir's poem, but it's actually a story about Thor. It's a really great adventure, almost a prototypical hero's journey, if you will. But, not to spoil anything, but it's going to be a really fun adventure. It's Thor going out into the world, going out into the unknown, and retrieving something that the gods need, and having a lot of fun while doing it. So I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, me too. It's basically like the best beer run ever.
Oh, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, so this is going to be just really enjoyable episode, I think. Lots of fun, lots of action. And I think before we get into it, just to acknowledge here, we're reading the Poetic Edda by Jackson Crawford, translated by Jackson Crawford. It's a great translation, very readable, easy to kind of follow along with. So check it out. We'll have a link in our show notes and our YouTube description here if you want to go purchase it off Amazon. And thank you to Jackson Crawford and Hackett Publishing for letting us use it. And just a little bit of information for you. The best way you can support the podcast, if you'd like to, if you wouldn't mind leaving us a review on iTunes, if you're using iTunes or Apple Podcasts, that's a big help for us. Really helps us reach more people. As well, sharing our stuff on social media would be really big help. So for your information, we're facebook.com/Northern Myths. Twitter, we're at Northern Myths. And on Instagram, we are Northern Myths Podcast. We're also on YouTube. We've got our channel, Northern Myths Podcast, there as well. If you haven't taken a look there, we got a lot of great clips from the show that we release, as well as an ongoing series from our Havamal that we release every Wednesday. And we're just trying to do a little more of an accessible thing. It's not all just 3-hour episodes there. So check us out. And if you like what we're doing there, a subscribe is always appreciated. So, without that out of the way, do you have anything to add, Dan?
No, I think we're good to go and join Thor and Tyr on their adventure to get beer.
Let's do it.
I didn't mean for that to rhyme.
That's also fine. Okay, so again, this is Hymiskvida, the fetching of the Cauldron. Starting with verses 1 to 3. A long time ago, the gods came back from hunting, but they started feeling thirsty before they were done eating. They waved their wands, looking for omens in blood, and they learned that Aegir owned some cauldrons. Aegir, giant from the stones, sat there, happy as a child. He looked much like Hymiskvida's son. Thor, son of Odin, stared fiercely into his eyes. "You will provide a feast for the gods." The argumentative god frustrated Aegir. The giant immediately sought some revenge against the gods. He asked Thor to fetch him a cauldron. "I promise to brew beer in it for all of you." So, Dan, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it starts as every good story would start with, coming back from hunting and being thirsty. And, they want some beer. And to give you an idea of the context of this, because it kind of sounds, weird. Why would the gods be feasting with this, with Aegir, who's giant from the stone? He's a giant, so he's obviously a friend of the gods, but he's not one of the gods. He's still outside of the tribe. And it points to a tradition in Scandinavia where the Scandinavian aristocracy would travel around their land and visit basically their tenant managers. So they'd go to some land that they owned, and the person who was in charge of taking care of it for them would also be in charge of providing a feast for them and basically hosting them while they were there checking over the land. And it would it would show the aristocracy, like, okay, is our person there collecting enough taxes? Are the people happy with him? Is it a prosperous land? So the context of it is sort of, the gods have gone to this place that they're in control of, but they have someone who's managing it for them. And that's one of the reasons why Thor asks Aegir for a feast. So it's not just coming out of nowhere. This is actually like tradition and well-known custom amongst the Scandinavians. So I thought that was interesting and really helped give it context. And then it still shows, though, that Thor was probably a little gruff in his way of asking for it. I'm sure there were nicer ways to do it, but Thor isn't necessarily known for his finesse. He's kind of a bull in a china shop. So there you have it.
Well, and we're going to get a lot of examples of how he is a bull in a china shop throughout this story. So
absolutely. And one thing I want to mention, just with some of the names, because it's interesting. So Aegir is ruler of the sea, or sea giant. Hymiskvida, it means mash brewer, which is exactly what you'd expect for someone who's going to brew beer. Like you brew alcohol sometimes out of mash. I mean, you can use other things, but that's a very common ingredient. And so it's sort of the beginning of an adventure. They're going to go off into the unknown to get this cauldron to brew beer, and it's also a very typical way of starting an adventure, where you need something, and so you go off into the unknown and to get it. And that's sort of where we're at with the story. It's like the most prototypical beginning to an adventure story that you could have.
Definitely. And the whole thing about this is it's almost like he's going after something mundane, sort of, you would think. But really, if they're not able to do this, to brew beer. So, I mean, first of all, beer would have been used a lot as just what you would kind of regularly drink, right? Alcoholic beverages kind of in general. And so, I mean, this is something that they're deprived of, first of all. But then it's also a case of the symbolism of alcohol being related to inspiration and, well, interacting with the unknown and with chaos. And mead certainly would be more associated with that. But I don't see a good reason not to extend that to beer, because it's the same concept, right? Beer would have, I suppose, just been the kind of the weaker, more mundane version. You know what I mean? Like it would have, I believe, if I'm getting this all right, if I found the right information, beer usually wouldn't have been that strong. At least the stuff that would have been brewed kind of generally here, it wouldn't have been that strong, especially compared to modern standards. And it really would have just been what you would drink at meals and wouldn't get all that drunk off of, but a little bit, sort of thing, right? Versus mead is a little, generally a little bit more hefty, if you will. So that's just a bit of a difference there. But it's just a funny thing that this is something mundane, kind of regardless of all that. It's sort of like one of those. It's almost a contrived quest, but it's still something that Thor can do that is going to bring a benefit to his tribe, right? And maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. The other point I wanted to get to was the omens that they were looking for in the magic and things like that. I just want to make a light point on this, that I suppose all of these systems of divining knowledge prior to science and prior to kind of an empirical method, maybe we think of that as primitive these days, or something that wouldn't necessarily work, because we tend to know how systems work in general and things affect one another. But this would have been a way that societies who didn't have access to this way of thinking would try and figure out the world and see patterns and connections. And I think part of this is almost them seeing patterns that work and attaching significance that today we might not necessarily think is accurate. But even if they were able to take, say, a 50-50 situation, something that's like literally a coin flip, and maybe get it right 60% of the time because they've noticed some kind of pattern in how it reacts with some kind of divination, something like that. Maybe it's even something even more kind of, how do I put it? Like a person that they would have considered like a seer or a sorcerer or something like that. Maybe they're just someone who has seen patterns in things in general, and they go through this whole divination process, but they know what they're going to say anyway. They know what they're going to predict or something like that. This is all just kind of me taking this idea and seeing what I can get out of it. But I really do think it's something like it was a way for pre-scientific societies to engage with patterns that they saw in the world and try and make better sense of them, which is honorable, I think, because it shows that they are trying to take control of their world in a way that they wouldn't have had the expert knowledge to, but it's still kind of an attempt to sort the world out around them.
Yeah, totally. I definitely agree with that. I think that I think too that in a lot of cases with divination, even as it's practiced today, one of the ways of debunking divination, I guess, is that you take the symbols that you see and then apply it to your life, and you sort of force your life into it or whatever. But it's kind of like, well, like exactly, yes, you would. That's exactly how you do it. You already, in some ways, if you're asking a question of tarot cards or I Ching or whatever else you might use, generally you probably already know the answer, but there are things that are, I don't know, making it uncomfortable probably for you to see it clearly in your head. So, you don't usually go to divination, I guess, for like, what should I have for dinner? It's more like, should I apply for this job or should I break up with this person? These like hefty questions where you probably already know the answer, but you've got conflicting emotions about it. And these things it kind of takes that out of it, and you can see clearly with it, even if there's no magical, like, oh, this is what's going to happen. It's like, oh, okay, you know what? I can, when I look at the cards, it removes my emotion from it. And okay, I know what I'm thinking now, and I can go forward. So it's I've sort of taken the magic part out of it, but there's still, I can see how it almost tricks your mind into taking out the stuff that would be complicating your thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great way to put it, I think, because it definitely means that there is value in doing this if you see value in it. You know what I mean? Like it's not, there's not nothing. It's not like there is zero value to something like this. And I mean, I think a lot of these things tend to be open to interpretation. Like, I don't really know a lot about tarot cards or runes for the purposes of divination, but I do know they are kind of very symbolic, and you can take these symbols much like we have, and you can see how a symbol can be applied to a story, which, any given life situation is a story in progress, essentially, the way I see it anyway. And so you can take these symbols and you can apply them in a lot of different ways, and just being open to that application already means that you're kind of seeing, you're trying to look at the things that underlie the fabric of reality in a way that maybe we don't know exactly how to do that even today. Because science can't explain how you're going to make a decision, although the Sam Harris types who would say that it's all just brain chemistry and everything is deterministic, they would disagree. But we can, at a very minimum, go in so many different directions from any situation, and so making this decision is I can see the value of doing something like this for making a decision, especially for societies that don't have the wealth of information that we do. And then, so here's why I think this whole thing is funny. They waved their wands and looked for omens in blood, which is, nice and graphic and all that, right? But they learned that Aegir owned some cauldrons. I wonder if it wasn't just something like, well, hey, Aegir always has a lot of beer. He must own some cauldrons. You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
It's like a way of seeing. They probably never saw the cauldrons, but they could infer that information, right? They could infer that he probably owned some cauldrons based on him having a lot of beer available, because that's what he was known for.
Absolutely. Actually, and just going back to the beer for a second, you're exactly right. Like, beer was one of the most common beverages because you couldn't drink the water. There was bacteria and stuff, and you would die. And it's very weird to think that, everyone listening to this podcast, at least in like North America and Europe, we're here because our mothers and foremothers drank while they were pregnant, drank alcohol, because it wasn't, it was better than the water. They would have died. And so I guess in some ways that's why it's important for them to get the beer, is that they actually have something to drink that won't kill them. But beer is a fascinating history. And you're right. There was an alcohol content to it, but not much. Probably just enough to like take the edge off of, how terrible life was back then. Like, okay, I can get up and plow the field again today, I guess. But
yeah, that's a great point. And there's humor to that, but it's also it's serious, right? It's
for sure. Like, that's like, it's as serious as like getting the plague. Like, that was your sort of the option, right? Like,
which decimated the population of Scandinavia more than once. Yeah.
Yeah.
Scandinavia was particularly vulnerable to the plague.
No. So yeah, any waterborne illness, you were able to survive it because you were drinking alcohol, because it got rid of it through the distillation.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Should we move on?
I think so.
Okay. Stanzas 4 to 6. Back to the poem. The gods did not know how to proceed. None of them could get a cauldron. But Tyr, in private, spoke to Thor alone and revealed a welcome secret. My mighty father, Hymir the Wise, lives to the east of Elivagar, near the end of the sky. He owns a cauldron that's a mile deep. It's the biggest cauldron of all. Thor said, Do you know if we can borrow this cauldron? Tyr said, Yes, friend, if we can play a few tricks.
So this is very interesting, mostly because it's Tyr who's doing the talking and sort of involving himself in the adventure. Tyr being the god of like honor and justice, and basically being forthright and having integrity. The famous story with Tyr is that he put his hand into Fenrir's mouth because they were trying to trick Fenrir into getting tied up, and Fenrir said, "Okay, well, if you're actually going to tie me up, like, or if you're not going to tie me up, then put your hand in, like, someone put your hand in my mouth, and I won't bite it if you release me, but if you keep me tied up, then I'm eating your hand." And Tyr did it, and they weren't going to release him, so he willingly sacrificed his hand. And here we have him saying, "Oh, we can get my father's, beer cauldron if we play a few tricks," which seems to be against character. But we have it as Tyr in this story, so we'll go with Tyr. But in other versions of this tale, it is Loki, and that makes, I think that probably makes more sense character wise, or like, it's not going against type as well. They're going to, I'm trying to remember, do they mention that? Well, yeah, so they don't mention it, but they allude to that Hymir, he's a giant, and we know that Loki is has giant blood in him. We're not so sure about Tyr. So it's interesting just to think that in some versions this was Loki, but in this one it's Tyr. And I don't know if we will stumble upon something that will tell us why it's Tyr and not Loki, or like why that change was made. But it's just something interesting to keep in mind, that the story may have changed at some point. Some things I want to mention. Elivigar, where they're going, means ice waves, so that's very much like they're going into the unknown, into the land of the giants. So again, just really fitting in with that adventure motif that, yeah, we're going into the unknown to get stuff. And Hymir, the name means darkening one, which again is like right on the head of, yeah, they're going into the dark unknown and to get his treasure, his cauldron. So it's really, it's following along the prototypical hero story, adventure story, and we're gonna see what happens as they go along.
Yeah, exactly. And well, I don't really have a whole lot to add here. Just I want to emphasize a couple of details. So I liked the line that the gods did not know how to proceed. None of them could get a cauldron. And so the implication there is that the collective of the gods as a whole is not able to get a cauldron, but extend that. They're not able to get this goal. They're not able to achieve this. But Thor is the one who's going to go out and attempt it, right? He's the one who is attempting to be the hero. And that even on its own is, well, it's really admirable, right? It's even just by going and making the attempt, that's already going out into the unknown and opening yourself up to chaos, opening yourself up to things that can cause growth, right? It's the reason that the hero story is so compelling is that it really gives us a blueprint of how we, humanity, can go out and grow and achieve things and achieve more than, our simple selves in our current state are currently able to achieve. And Thor is the one who's up to the challenge here. And it underscores to me why Thor is so beloved, because he's the one who's going to go and undertake this prototypical journey. And we've talked about how Odin also kind of does this hero role thing, like how he fills that. Odin is unique, just to put it mildly, right? But Odin doesn't really have a story where he does exactly this, where he goes out into the unknown and it's this quest and stuff like that. Odin's hero-worthy features tend to be a little more murky and muddled and things like that. And Thor here he's going to go on this quest to get this cauldron. And I mean, again, this might not sound all that glamorous, but as we've mentioned, it's something that the gods need. And now here we see none of the other gods are willing to do it, right? So Thor already is distinguishing himself by kind of being up for that challenge. And then, as you said, like Elivagar being near the end of the sky, it just emphasizes how far they have to go. It's a far journey. They're really going much past, what most people would dare to do, right? So it's just underscores that this is going to be, a long journey and probably hard, and it's going to be in the unknown, everything like that. So
for sure, I love that you brought up Odin, because we're going to see the real difference between how Thor and Odin would go about doing these things. Thor he's kind of a straight line. Like there's no cunning to him. There's no guile. It's just, you have it, I'm going to go get it. With Odin, and the closest match to this story I can think of is when you get the meat of poetry. And it's not like a perfect, what am I trying to say? It doesn't like overlay perfectly on each other. They're not super similar, but Thor is going to go contend with giants, and not to spoil anything, but it's Thor, so there's going to be a few fights. Whereas Odin goes and seduces and lies and tricks his way into it, and it's just very different. And when you said Odin was unique, I think that's exactly right, especially in a society like with Thor. You can build a society around that because it's ordered and orderly. With Odin, you couldn't. If everyone is to behave like Odin, things would fall apart almost immediately, and I imagine lots of people would die because you'd want to kill them because he's lying all the time to you and seducing a wife. Like, yeah, so it only works for Odin kind of thing, you know, whereas Thor, you can actually like, you could have a society where people emulate Thor and it would work.
Yeah, you probably get a very, very small few exceptional people who emulate Odin to the fullest extent.
For sure.
Not to say that Odin isn't a good example of certain ways of being, and we're going to get into that very specifically in the finale to the Havamal, which is going to be upcoming, should be a couple of episodes after this one. So just, look forward to that. But this one is going to definitely be a really good showcase of all of the attributes of Thor, both good and bad.
Definitely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of anything else that I'd want to mention. No, I think I'm good to move on.
Let's go. Stanza 7. Back to the poem. They left swiftly and traveled the whole day from Asgard, till they came to Egil's house. They left Thor's big-horned goats in his care, and then they went to where Hymir lived.
So this is kind of neat because we often talk about how we have to understand that some of this is assumed knowledge, that the people listening to these stories would know exactly what was being referenced without, needing a podcast to like explore what was being referenced. So this is one of those references where it's one of the more famous stories of Thor, and actually in the story it's Thor and Loki. They go out and they're going out to have a grand adventure, and they go to Egil's house. And Egil means, from what I could tell, was edge or like sharpened sword. And in this version, Egil is actually Tyr's uncle. So they go to his house and leave Thor's goats there, and his goats pull his wagon. But that there's a story where Thor and Loki go out, have a grand adventure, and leave their goats with this family, and they actually mentioned it at the very end again too. I don't know if we want to get into it then or talk a little bit about it here.
Yeah, I'd rather leave it to the end.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, there's going to be a detail later that is going to kind of tie things together.
So I guess just from here, just know that this is sort of, it's almost like a prequel or a weird interweaving of this story with this other very famous story that gets very explicitly referenced at the very end of this poem. So we'll talk more about that then.
Perfect. I do not have anything to add. So
okay,
let's
go.
Move on.
Yeah.
All right. Stanzas 8 and 9. Back to the poem. Tyr found his ugly grandmother. She had 900 heads. But another woman was there, all golden, with a pretty face, and gave her son a beer. Son of giants, she said, I'll hide you courageous men beneath the cauldron. My husband will abuse any guests who come to our house.
So stanza number 8 is actually probably my favorite stanza in the poem, because it's kind of a throwaway, right? Like it's just mentioning Tyr's grandmother, but Tyr found his ugly grandmother. She had 900 heads. That to me, like, I want to know more about the grandmother. That to me is awesome. From what I can gather from it, and it's actually one of the reasons why I think Tyr fits in the story as well, is that I am going to go with the idea that the grandmother would be like the representation of like the divine feminine and, undifferentiated chaos. Having 900 faces to me means that she would have virtually every aspect or every possibility. The number 9 is sacred for many, many ancient cultures, including the Norse, and it was considered a complete number because every number is like 1 to 9 is in it, kind of thing. And then after that, like you're just rearranging those numbers, so you've got every number you need up from 1 to 9. as well in other cultures, not so much the Norse, but it's a trinity of trinities, and there's a whole bunch of interesting things you can do with the number 9. So it was very sacred, and it was considered complete, and that's why it was sacred. It's considered complete, and so you have like the complete divine feminine from, its shadow to everything that's good about it. And then we see Tyr's mother, who's bedecked in gold, and obviously she would be a representation of like all the motherly goodness that you could muster. I mean, she offers them a beer and is going to protect them from her husband and Tyr's father, who has questionable hospitality practices, let's say, which is actually like a pretty big deal. And you can see also her hospitality, and like she's offered her guests a drink. Now it is her son, so she probably feels a certain affinity towards Tyr, but it's neat that we're just getting so much information about Tyr's family and about the general practices within the household, and it's establishing that Hymir isn't going to like. He might like Tyr being there, but he's not going to like Thor being there. And that's, we'll see more of that as we go on.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the divine feminine. And what I know of the divine feminine mostly comes from Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. Mostly, he's got a fantastic, I don't think it's specifically a chapter, but a section of a chapter on specifically the divine feminine. And it was Eric Neumann, right, who wrote essentially the main book on all this. And I think others have touched on the divine feminine, others that we really, really like. Eric Neumann being a student of Carl Jung's, and who really fleshed out a lot of Jung's ideas about archetypes and all that. I think that's who wrote that book.
It is. No, and that's like the book on the feminine. Like I haven't got it yet, but it's at the top of my list of like books to read, because
likewise. No, and I mean, the basics of it is that the feminine has all the potential for destruction and creation at the same time. And I like one of the best images of the divine feminine is the Hindu goddess Kali. And an image of hers, if I'm remembering this correctly, is something like she is devouring a man while giving birth to another, something like that. That's like a common image. And isn't that just like gross and grotesque and everything like that? But it's supposed to symbolize everything that feminism could possibly represent. And it's brutal, it's destructive, but it's also creative. And yeah, so having this, it's like Tyr being descended from this makes perfect sense. And it also, in a lot of ways, I think ties into, so with her being his grandmother, that puts Tyr very close to the origins of the world symbolically. You know what I mean? Because even in other stories that really dig into the symbolism that we've kind of found here, they're creation stories. They're stories of how the world is formed. And I mean, the closest thing that we referenced this a fair bit is that I would connect this to is the Babylonian story of Marduk, who is the hero who creates the world, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about this more elsewhere, but the reason the symbolism makes sense to me is that Tiamat is the symbol of the chaotic feminine in that particular story, the undifferentiated chaos, and Marduk is only a couple of generations removed from Tiamat and her husband or consort Apsu. I think he's a great-grandson, something like that. So
something like that, yeah.
Like 3 generations removed. And so what I'm actually connecting this to here is that if Tyr is related to his grandmother, only 2 generations removed, is this symbol of undifferentiated chaos and the divine feminine, that puts him very, very close to the creation of the world and emphasizes his divinity. And that's important because Tyr, theoretically, and it is purely theoretical, would have been the original head of the Norse pantheon, mostly because his name means God. His name is related to Zeus. It's related to the Indian Dios Pater. It's sort of the original Indo-European word for God. And, as you might know, Zeus is the head of the Greek pantheon, and he kind of stayed there. And Tyr, if he was kind of this original head god, this original kind of king god, well, then it would make sense that he is so close to kind of the creation of the world in that sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, yeah, I'm totally there with you. And with Tyr being such a force of order, I think it just strengthens that comparison to Marduk. That, yeah, like, of course, coming from like the complete chaos, the undifferentiated chaos, and being the head of the pantheon for who knows how long. And if you think about it, so he's no longer the head of the pantheon, but like his name is related to all of these heads of pantheons that are going back who knows how long in human history. So like this, even though in Norse stories, he doesn't have many stories about him really, but just the etymology of his name, like, and I would say having this grandmother, like, like he wasn't there at the very beginning, but certainly at the beginning of like human civilization.
Right. And we've touched on some theories on why he might have kind of fallen from this place, right, as head of the pantheon. Touched on that a little bit. I think it was in our Grimnismal episodes 7 and 8, something like that. And I won't rehash that here, but there's certainly possible reasons for why he might not be the head of the pantheon anymore. But this connection is really cool for how, he might have kind of been in that situation. And I think more evidence for how he would have actually been originally, on a symbolic level, kind of the original head.
Absolutely. And I know right at the beginning we were talking about how it seems more like Loki would fit into this story, but I actually see, like, with this stanza, Tyr is the one who like fits into this stanza far better than Loki, I would say.
Definitely. And then his mother as well is she's sort of like an instantiation of this sort of prototypical chaotic divine feminine being, right? And that's almost the whole point, is that all possible aspects of feminism come from this kind of prototypical one, right? And so if you've got one that's nurturing and motherly, that's one example of the possibilities that can kind of come out of that. And if she produced Tyr, that's very good, right? So all the things are pretty cool in this little section, right?
For sure.
Shall we move on?
Let's move on.
Stanzas 10 to 12. Back to the poem. That angry, hard-minded man came home late from his fishing, came into his hall. Glaciers shook at each step. The beard on his face was frozen. Hymir's concubine, Tyr's mother, said, "Hail, Hymir, come in and be happy. Your son has come to your home, as we expected, after his long absence, and our famous enemy, the friend of humans, Thor, son of Odin, follows him. You see them sitting beneath your own hall's roof. They're hiding by that wall." The giant reached out and broke the wall and snapped a beam in half.
So you have I dare say, sort of typical situation where, like, the mother and the wife is like trying to give her husband a heads up that he's coming home after a hard day of work, and there's his son's there, which is probably not too bad, but then it's like, oh, and our famous enemy, the friend of humans, Thor, is here too, which I actually think it's kind of it might be like an insurance policy for Tyr, so that if Hymir was going to abuse Tyr, it's like, well, you've actually got like the number one person who's killed the most giants ever here, so like maybe slow your roll and be calm, and you're actually going to have to engage in hospitality here. Otherwise, Thor is going to kill you, because that's what he does. And then you have Hymir smashing the wall. And I wonder if he's smashing the wall because he can't smash Tyr and Thor, because again, it would be inhospitable, and Thor might smash him back, right? So it's just like, it really is like a rollicking adventure right from the get-go. And there's funny parts and adventurous parts. Like, I would imagine, back in the day, this would be one of the favored stories, because it's such a good one,
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, here, just the imagery of Hymir here, like, I mean, he is formidable. Glaciers shook at each of his steps, right? And I mean, it's sort of like he is this formidable figure in his own right. I mean, he reaches out and breaks a wall. So I mean, he's no pushover either, right? And well, it's interesting. So my take on Tyr's mother here is almost that her true allegiance is still to Hymir, still to her husband, and maybe they've got some kind of resentment or something. Well, maybe that's the wrong word. Some kind of lingering feelings over Tyr potentially leaving them, and possibly founding this nation. Like, again, Tyr is one of those gods where we've just lost so much of his backstory, right? And I mean, we can fill in a few things symbologically if we choose to place him in a certain archetype, but that's a conscious choice, and that's certainly some conjecture on our part, right? And so for me here, what I see is that if Tyr has come back, like, maybe there's this intrigue, maybe there's all this like, has Tyr led Thor into a trap? Like, the telling of this, I think it could get into so much more. Like, this story could be so much more interesting if we had some of those finer details, right? But obviously we don't, unfortunately. But even just what this alludes to here, your son has come home as we expected. Like, that line on its own, almost like that implies something else. Maybe there's something more sinister going on here, or maybe they thought Tyr was always going to come home. Maybe he's some kind of double agent, but we don't have that extra detail there. It's just these little lines that kind of point to something. But the fact that she says here that she's going to hide Tyr and Thor behind this cauldron, whatever, and then rats them out right away. That's kind of, I don't know, that's a little bit sketchy. But maybe, like you said, she's just trying to smooth things over, as opposed to turning on Tyr or something like that, which would fit into a lot of the archetypal symbolism for women as being peacemakers, uniting tribes and things like that. Like, when we had Caroline Larrington on, she talked about the story, I think it's the Hladningavig, something like that. A woman caught between her father and her lover, or something like that, and always resurrecting the two of them as they fight each other until Ragnarok, something like that.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's a great story too. But yeah, no, there is a real, especially with women, there's that real tension between the father and the mother, because marriage was usually for political reasons rather than love. Like, I think I've said this in a fairly recent episode, but love as the criteria for who you marry is a very recent modern thing. Before that, it was, how are we going to unite families? What's going to be best for sometimes like the village or the kingdom or wealth, like those reasons. Love didn't really factor into it too much. But yeah, no, I think I tend to take the idea that she was sort of hiding them so that he didn't immediately come home and see Thor, the giant killer, in his hall, and just like, he would have attacked him. I would assume he'd attack him without talking to him. This at least gets him to talk first before anything might happen.
Yeah, that's certainly the more charitable and optimistic way of looking
for sure.
So let's go with that one. I think you probably got it right on that regard there. But shall we move on?
Let's do it.
Okay, stanzas 13 to 16. Back to the poem. 8 cauldrons shattered, except a well-forged one, which fell in one piece. Thor and Hymir came forward. The old giant bent his gaze upon his enemy. His thoughts were not kind when he fixed his eyes on Thor, killer of giants, here in his own home. But the giant ordered 3 bulls killed. Reluctantly, he ordered them cooked. They beheaded the bulls and brought them to the cook pot. And before he went to bed, Thor, son of Odin, ate 2 whole bulls of Hymir's. Gray-haired old Hymir saw it would be costly to feed the hunger of Thor. If all 3 of us want to eat tomorrow, then we'd better go fishing.
So we have Hymir here engaging in hospitality and proper hospitality because I think because he has to. Thor's the killer of giants and Thor is in his own home, so he's kind of being held hostage to it. Or what's that word? It's not blackmail. It's I can't think of it, but it's like when the mob comes by and says, "Hey, we'll protect you for money." Yeah. There's like a word for it that's just escaping me at the moment, but extortion. He's basically extorting hospitality from Thor is basically extorting hospitality from Hymir. And I've read some commentaries where they mention that Thor eating 2 bulls was probably like making Hymir pay for like being hospitable. It's kind of like, okay, I know you don't want to do this, and I'm going to bring it right up to the line of, as a guest, being hospitable, just to rub your face in it just a bit. And I think Hymir actually acts quite respectably. He says, okay, if I'm going to continue to feed you, like, we're going to have to go fishing tomorrow because I'm not going to have enough food for you. I wonder too if there's a sense on a symbolic level of the cost of sort of like orderliness coming into a new area, like settling a new area. I know, at least in North America, when people settled the West, the buffalo population took a huge hit because now you had, instead of like a nomadic people traveling, which I don't think requires as much resource, when you have a settlement that requires a lot more resources to keep going and that kind of thing. So I thought about that. I don't really have anything else to go on with that, but just as a symbol, I thought it kind of worked.
Definitely. And the whole point about the hospitality thing here, I mean, the reluctant hospitality, but it just underscores how key to society it was. I mean, we've certainly covered this a whole bunch, especially in our episodes on the Havamal, but yeah, like it's even towards one's enemy, he has to be hospitable and has to do it. I mean, it's also funny. Like, I mean, if he's getting extorted, I mean, maybe that doesn't make it so much of a nice thing where it's like, okay, well, even if it's your enemy, you're still going to be hospitable. But, I think the point still stands. It also shows the magnitude of Thor's actions, though, right? So, I mean, regardless of whether it's like, bringing order into a chaotic region or whatnot, but, Thor, like, he's literally, he's thunder, he's lightning, he's very, very destructive wherever he goes. And I mean, we've said he's kind of like a one-trick guy. Like he only does the one thing, which is be this big guy, be this big presence, and he can eat a lot, obviously, and he does. And I mean, maybe he's doing this maliciously to rub Hymir's face and having to be hospitable, but maybe it's also just, oh, I'm still hungry, I'm gonna just keep eating, something like that, right? Which on one level kind of would fit with Thor's personality as being kind of this just fun-loving, generally fun to be around guy who happens to eat a lot, drink a lot, and he has the potential to get violent if you insult him or the people around him.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's a lot of Thor being Thor.
Exactly. So, shall we continue?
I think so, yes.
Stanzas 17 to 19. back to the poem. Thor said he was willing to row and fish if the bold giant would let him have some bait. Hymir said, well, giant killer, if you're brave enough, go out to my herd. You'll find some bait there. I suspect you'll find it easy to take some bait from one of my oxen. So Thor went quickly out in the forest, and he saw before him a black ox. Thor broke the whole head off the ox, gripping its horns. Hymir said, what you've done here is even worse than it was having you inside, sitting and eating.
Oh, Thor just goes out and rips the head off of an ox for bait. First of all, if you, no spoiler, but what's he gonna catch? And I think again, he asked permission for it, and he was told, what to do by Hymir. So he followed Hymir's instructions, but to that line before it gets where he's being a bad guest. And yeah, he's just every chance he's getting to sort of poke his thumb in Hymir's eye, he's taking it, but still just at the line where he's still being hospitable, and it's all still above board, so you couldn't start a fight, right? Thor's just being that annoying guest who's just doing enough to annoy you, but not enough to be able to use the rules of hospitality against him.
Right. And I mean, I think the funny thing too here is, as you said, exactly that he followed the instructions exactly. And I mean, the whole thing with that is that it's almost like Hymir didn't expect him to be able to do anything. I think he gave him a task that really he wasn't supposed to fill properly. It was like, are you gonna really think you're gonna go out there and get bait from my ox? What's he supposed to do? Getting the head off the ox seems like a very natural thing for Thor, for his mind to go. It's like, what am I going to do here? Am I going to, reach into its mouth and take its tongue or something like that? Well, that would be mean. Am I going to grab some horns? Well, that's probably not pretty good bait. Well, the whole head. Here we go. It's funny. I wonder if this is scientifically possible, but whether a lightning strike or something right on the right part of the neck or something could decapitate an animal out in the field or something.
I have no idea.
I have no idea. That's probably not realistic, but maybe.
That'd be funny. If someone saw that happen and that's how that came into the story. I don't know. I don't think that's generally how lightning works. However, I don't know enough about it. So again, I'm not going to ask for a video, a video link if anyone has this on video, because I don't really want to see that. But if anyone has heard of anything like this, definitely let us know, because that's kind of cool.
Exactly. That's just my own speculation on this, but it's sort of like Thor goes and does this thing, this supposedly impossible task. He goes and does it, right? He doesn't go and think, well, what? You're playing a trick on me. There's no way I could get bait from oxen or something like that. But he just goes and figures it out, right? So again, Thor is being the heroic guy, but he's doing it. He's going directly to the letter too, which maybe underscores why you shouldn't kind of mess with Thor, sort of thing. Not try and trick him, because he's just going to go kind of direct for it, and you might not like the results.
For sure. And actually, it's interesting that Tyr is the one with him, because Tyr is also known to be the one who would follow the law right to the letter of it. I think it's Forseti who comes after Ragnarok, and I think he's Baldur's son. He is known more as to be the justice is also one of his areas of expertise, but he's more known for taking other things into consideration and sort of muddling about in the areas of gray, whereas Tyr gave up his hand to follow the letter of the law or the agreement. It'd be very hard to argue with Tyr against that and to inject shades of gray, because Tyr could just be show his stump and be like, no, you're following the letter of the law here.
Right. And I mean, again, I didn't want to get into this too far, but that's part of why I think Tyr eventually kind of declined, right? On a symbolic level, him following the letter of the law too closely made him the symbolic connection that I make is that he's related to this archetype of the willfully blind father, which, well, following the letter of the law to the letter every time, even to your own detriment. I think what that says is that you aren't looking at nuance. You aren't looking at the things that have changed since the law was set in stone. You know what I mean? Literally or figuratively. And Tyr then is sort of blind to these things that have changed in the world around him, and he literally gets bitten by it. I'm oversimplifying just slightly because, I don't want to take us down a long tangent on this one, but it's why I connect Tyr to possibly having kind of fallen, because they needed a king who was able to engage with chaos and take into consideration the changing environment, especially post the end of the golden age that gets talked about in the Voluspa, which essentially every civilization has that symbol, by the way, is like this idea of a golden age that we hopefully want to return to one day. And I think a god like Tyr, a very orderly god, is good in a situation like that, because he can handle the rules when things are all going predictably and going well, right? But then the rules start to become out of date, and they aren't so relevant anymore. And following those rules to the letter in the light of changing circumstances, I think, is possibly what contributes to Tyr's downfall. And the only reason kind of I make that connection is because it's paralleled in especially Egyptian mythology. This is the story of Osiris and Horus and Seth, and there's a whole thing there. But he parallels actual examples that we have, just never explicitly. It's only in kind of these whispers. And if Tyr is the one who is this, he is this to the letter of the law, that's what would contribute to that.
Absolutely. The only other thing I'd mention, and I think we actually get to it a bit more in the next group of stanzas, so maybe I'll save it for then, but I was going to talk about Thor rowing the boat, so maybe I'll save that for the next one.
Well, let's just move on then.
Sounds good.
Stanzas 20 and 21. Back to the poem. Then Thor asked the giant to come with him to sea, to row out with him. But Hymir rowed a little, and was unwilling to row any further out in the deep sea. Famous Hymir caught a whale, and then caught 2 whales on one hook. But Odin's son sat in the rear and craftily baited his own hook.
So for me, the big takeaway from this is that Thor is willing to go out into the unknown as far as possible to get what he needs, and that he's fully confident in his ability to deal with whatever is going to come up. Now, I don't want to make Hymir look too much like he's not also willing to do that, because he was willing to go out into the unknown. And he catches 2 whales on one hook. Like, Hymir's no slouch, and actually he's known as the wise. Like, it's easy to look at the story and see how Hymir's he's kind of a bit of that, like, buffoon a little bit, like, especially like you'd see it in cartoons today, or at least when I was growing up, where you'd have the big lug buffoon kind of guy who was the big bad guy that, the heroes would be trying to trick or, defeat in some manner. But Hymir's got more to him than that. He's capable and very skilled at his own thing. Like, catching 2 whales is quite impressive. And from a symbolic level, like, he's going into the unknown, into the deep unknown, and getting these 2 like huge prizes, like that, that's going to feed them for, well, not Thor, but in general, like humans, like whales feed quite a few humans for quite a while. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, even today in the Faroe Islands, they have their kind of own whale hunt sort of thing, and that's actually like basically directly for hundreds, even thousands of years has been done. Like the entire population of the Faroe Islands participates in this essentially in order to get some portion of the whale, and then that's like a significant amount of their food supply. And I mean. Some of them have gotten in trouble, actually. Some Faroese people have gotten in trouble over kind of being associated with all this, but it's actually like their indigenous way of hunting and living and everything like that. And it goes right back to this. And so, yeah, like Hymir being able to do this, it's a big accomplishment. He is very skilled, very accomplished, but Thor has other ideas. You know what I mean? Like he sees what Hymir is doing, and Hymir is obviously being successful. Thor is hanging back and watching this. You know what I mean? This comes back to some concepts we talk about in the Havamal a little bit, where it's like it's good, it's wise to sit back and listen to the wise people around you. I think that extends to actions, right? Like that's how you would learn a new skill, something like that. That's not to imply that Thor was necessarily not good at fishing prior to this, but at a minimum, he's watching arguably a master fisherman. I think you would call Hymir something like that, right? Catching 2 whales on one hook.
I'm impressed. So yeah,
exactly. At least he's impressive, right? So Thor has his own ideas. That just all speaks to the idea of innovating on what has already been proven to be good. You know what I mean? Like Hymir as a giant, like being the wise. And again, another side to this with kind of a connection to Tyr here. You know, if his father is this wise giant and then he sort of becomes the head of this tribe of the Aesir or something like that, it's almost like Tyr takes the wisdom of his father and turns it into a society, does something with it. That's just an aside. But then for Thor here, you know, Thor might be having his own ideas on how he can do even better than Hymir, how he can do even better than this wise giant, right? So it's all pointing more and more to Thor just being this guy who's willing to encounter the unknown and do the very best he possibly can and innovate, which is the another aspect of the hero. I won't say the other because that doesn't make too much sense. Another aspect of the hero story is that innovation, doing something that hasn't been done before in order to solve the problems of the current day, right?
Exactly.
So should we find out what happens with Thor here?
Absolutely.
Okay. Back to the poem. Stanzas 22 to 24. Thor, friend of humans, enemy of the serpent, put the ox's head on his hook. Then the gaping Midgard serpent came up, the one that hates the gods and lives in the encircling sea. The bold Thor pulled bravely to bring that poison-slick serpent up on board. With his hammer, he struck a blow on the head of Fenrir's serpent brother. The monster howled, volcanoes erupted, and the old earth trembled all over. But that sea monster sank back into the waves.
So it gets pretty, like, if you thought catching 2 whales on one hook was epic, like here we have Thor catching the world serpent, the Midgard serpent, the one who encircles the earth, the one that he's going to fight at Ragnarok. So, and actually in some versions of the story, they actually have the fight that happens at Ragnarok in this story, and then, you know, he kills the serpent, and that's sort of that. But there seems to be, they don't know if Snorri was sort of, let's say, massaging it so that you had the serpent at Ragnarok as well. But there is, it's not cut and dry how the story actually went. But for me, I prefer, you know, this where they meet and then the serpent goes away so that they can meet at Ragnarok again. But just so you know that some versions do have Thor killing the serpent here. As well, some versions have Thor fighting with the serpent, and his feet go through the bottom of the boat, and that's how hard he's trying to pull the serpent up. And there'll be kind of a similar motif to that later on in this story, but it's not in this particular one. As well, they have in other versions of it, Hymir gets freaked out because it's the Midgard serpent, and he cuts the line on Thor, and Thor slaps him upside the head because he's really upset that he let the serpent go. So all these different versions, but it's really like one. It's an awesome visual and set piece where you have Thor like catching the serpent of the world, and really his counterpart to, if Thor is order, then you have the serpent, who is chaos and the unknown, and sort of the ultimate representation of that. And something I really like about this is the bait that he uses, because the head of an ox, not only, I'm sure, would it be delicious to a giant worm, like giant serpent, but in that time it was, and even today, oxen and cattle are a form of wealth. And so what you have is Thor taking the symbol of wealth, plunging it, and literally putting it on the line and plunging it into the unknown so that he can get the best thing that he can. And then, the serpent comes up. So I think it really shows you, at least archetypally, how that when you go into the unknown, if you're going to get something, or if you're going to get the best of something out of the unknown, you have to put something on the line that's of worth to you.
That's a great point, actually. I can't believe we haven't already touched on that oxen and cattle and that were that symbol of wealth. In fact, it's almost the typical symbol of wealth, like in the proper sense. It's the specific symbol of wealth at that time. And so the prior things that Thor did, like eating 2 bulls, he ate. That's like eating a super expensive meal, essentially, and then killing another one just for bait, something like that. That's almost like wasteful. I mean, I hope they eat that bull, because then it's at least they get a meal out of it. But no, it's like, that's crazy. And then here, I love that, where it's like he puts something valuable on the line. That's almost a key detail here, because it's like you do have to put something on the line. You do need to have something you're able to sacrifice. And I mean, making that a universal, it's almost like you've got to have some skin in the game, or you got to have something to lose in order to get the right motivation to do these things. And I mean, so Hymir, he's just kind of doing almost the mundane thing. He's doing it impressively. He gets these whales, but Thor, he's going after the greatest enemy, which is the greatest prize. And well, I mean, that just says that he has his aim on the greatest thing that he can accomplish, right? And I mean, this entire story isn't even about this, right? If this were like a movie, this would almost be like kind of an out of the blue thing. This would be just like the coolest set piece to this movie, right? Like you said, this would go on for 10 minutes. This would be just this huge epic battle. He's striking hammer blows and stuff like that. Like this could be a part of a modern blockbuster film. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. This is like a summer smash hit if I've ever seen one, for sure.
Definitely. And so, I mean, this is where this comes from, right? And he's going after this greatest enemy. That the Ouroboros is really the symbolic equivalent for what the Midgard serpent is, and that's like if you haven't seen it, it's the image of a snake that's eating itself, which is to symbolize the matrix of chaos and potential and destruction and creation. If you're confused as to how there's this divine feminine symbol and then there's also this Ouroboros, they are different, but they're very similar in that they symbolize a lot of these same things. But it's almost like all the potential that underlays the world, and it has the potential to destroy, but the potential to create out of that destruction, sort of thing. And as an enemy of order, like it's almost like it's the symbol of all of the things that could go wrong with someone who's trying to order the world, right? This is Thor. directly opposing the ultimate symbol of the things he is trying to put into order. You know what I mean? So, I think you're exactly right, Dan, where it's like he cannot defeat him until Ragnarok, because symbolically, the world is never going to be without those things that cause chaos and cause disorder. It's never going to be away from that. The world has to be destroyed for that to kind of be the case. And we sort of make the point in our third episode, Voluspa 3, where even the action of Thor destroying the Midgard serpent might have been, inadvertently part of what finally does the world in at the end, sort of thing, right? And maybe not, but that was just kind of one reading of it. But the fact that he can't defeat him now, he at least has the goal of it, right? And this is going to be like his lifelong nemesis. He doesn't ever get him until Ragnarok. So that's sort of like, that must be like a blaze of glory sort of thing, right? Where Thor finally gets his prize, and his life is sort of complete by that point. He's done his job. There's not much more for him to do after that point, and then the world's reborn. So,
well, because after Thor kills the Midgard serpent, I think he takes 9 steps and then falls over dead because he was poisoned by the venom of the serpent. And because order is as harmful as chaos in an extreme, right? So you don't want either in the extreme one. You can't either, there's too much chaos and you just can't function in it because you're probably going to die, or you're too worried about dying that there's no real, you can exist and survive, but there's no real living. But then if there's too much order, I mean, there's nothing coming in to rejuvenate the society or yourself. There's nothing there's no adaptation. And if you don't adapt, you also die, and you're snuffing out creativity, like all those amazing things that you absolutely need. And so, I think the proper way is to have, and this has been said by many people before, but 1 foot in chaos, 1 foot in order, so that you can contend with both and move between both and you're comfortable with both.
Exactly. And I mean, the idea that the two of them kind of always are canceling each other out is also sort of symbolic, right? Because they cancel each other out here. They, like, Thor can't win, but neither can the serpent. And so, I mean, at the end, they both cancel each other out. It's all a big thing here, but it's all, this particular instance of this story is like just the biggest piece of action. Like, we can't do it justice with the way this poem is even laid out here. It's like, I really, really wish we had the mastery of, telling these stories the way they would have. And I mean, I'm sure it would have been like, if you're around the campfire, this would be like just such a dramatic moment and all that. But no, Thor goes after the biggest possible prize. And what's more heroic than that, though?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
And I mean, again, I wish there was more I could do to emphasize how cool this thing is, but it's like, well, I think we've discussed it enough, though.
Definitely. Yeah, let's keep going.
Perfect. Stanzas 25 to 27. Back to the poem. The giant was gloomy as they rowed home. He sat at the oars and said not a word as they steered the boat back toward land. Hymir said, "Share my work with me. Do your half. Either take the whales to my house or stay and tie up the boat." Thor went and grabbed up the boat and oars. He didn't bail out the water. He just lifted the whole thing. And he took the whole boat with its oars and buckets. It was a good boat. To the home of the giant. Thor carried it through the forest.
So we have Hymir, who's probably a little, well, he's had a big day. I mean, it's not every day you see the Midgard serpent, at least not for someone who's not Thor. And, he caught 2 whales, so he probably thought like, oh, I'm going to best Thor. Because remember, Thor is famous and probably infamous for the giants because he's such a giant killer. So catching 2 whales, he's probably like, oh, I'll show this Thor. And then he pulls up the entire Midgard serpent. He's like, oh, crap. So he's kind of grumpy about that. And they get back and he's like, okay, like, do your part. We both went out. Fishing. And I think that's an entirely reasonable request is, either take the whales up or the boat. I'm going to skate over the idea of, carrying a whale by yourself is incredible as well. But just in this, they're dividing up the labor, but then Thor just picks up the boat and doesn't even bail it out. He's just bringing it up to the house. And to me, it sort of seems like he's trying to be helpful. I don't know if he's actually being helpful because he didn't say, take the boat and bring it to the house. He said, tie it up and like leave it at the dock. So it kind of seems like he's taking advantage of hospitality again and being a little bit of a jerk.
Well, I like to think that he probably took it to the house and then tied it up at the house, something like that. Like
that might be it. Yeah.
Letter of the law. And I mean, this really isn't to make Thor sound like a simpleton where he can only follow basic instructions, but it's probably something like, I want to think more like he's joking. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'll tie the boat up at the house just to show how strong I am, sort of thing. And I don't know, probably something to do with the whole pushing hospitality to its limits and being a jokester. I mean, again, Thor is supposed to be friends with Loki, like good friends with Loki. And I mean, I think you can't be good friends with Loki if you're not kind of joking and a trickster and something like that. But he's sort of also, as the symbol of order and everything like that. But, maybe he can see the funny side or whatever. I don't think that's bringing chaos into things. That's just.
No, I think it is just kind of a joke and, he's kind of being a brat, kind of being it's funny. I thought it was funny.
Yeah, definitely. And at a minimum, he's going above and beyond what the task was that was set out for him. He's overachieving the task again. Like he overachieved by, catching the Midgard. Well, I didn't catch him, but going after the Midgard serpent. He showed Hymir up. He's showing him up again here, right? And maybe that's the whole entire point. Like we talked about how like Vafthrudnismal, that was sort of like the other one.
Grimnismal?
No, like the one that's sort of more like the rap battle. That was like Arborsleo. Yeah. Thor and Odin kind of going at it with like all these insults and stuff like that. Who's better than the other, one upping each other, and this almost seems like kind of the same thing. And I mean, maybe we don't go into it directly, but Thor could have just taken the cauldron that he wanted or asked for it or something like that. I think the implication is probably something like he's got to spend the time and show Hymir that he's worthy of having the cauldron. That's just not kind of explicitly being stated yet. And he's overachieving on every task to be like, oh yeah, I definitely got this. Like I'm definitely worthy of this cauldron.
Absolutely. That's something we haven't talked about too much, but when you go into the unknown to get the prize, you have to be worthy of the prize. You could very well go into the unknown and be defeated and have to slink back home. Or die. Like these stories, because they're heroes, they've sort of, by definition of a hero, they've accomplished it. But that's not to say it's easy or that everyone can accomplish it, because that's just not the case. Like us mere mortals are going to go into the unknown and fail probably more often than we go into the unknown and succeed. Like that's one of the tragedies and sufferings of life, is that there's only so much we can do on our first attempt to go into it. Yeah, but
yeah, I know, and I mean here, like as far as Thor being worthy of achieving this cauldron, right? Like maybe even if it wasn't like one of those tasks that was set out at the beginning, like if Hymir is like, I'm catching some whales, so Thor has to one up him. Like the only way to one up him is to go after the Midgard serpent. Like, oh man, like he is doing his utmost here to do this, and he is being as heroic as possible, doing all the most crazy things that he possibly can. And like he hasn't even got there. He hasn't even got his prize yet, but like he's just going above and beyond is I think the point here with this boat thing.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Shall we move on?
Let's go.
Stanzas 28 and 29. Back to the poem. But the giant was still angry. He demanded a test of strength from Thor. He said it was no test at all to row a boat, but a truly strong man would be able to break his cup. So Thor took the cup in hand, but he broke a stone trying to shatter that glass cup. Then he threw it through a wall, but it was brought back unbroken to Hymir.
So for Hymir, it's not enough that he was strong enough to pull up the world serpent or to carry the boat to the house. He now has to like prove that he's worthy of this cauldron. And it seems it's kind of a weird like task, right? Like break this cup that I have. Like I had to think about it because I was pretty sure there was something to it. And what I came up with, and this is just like me thinking about it, so I'm quite open to other interpretations. But I was thinking about how we've talked about alcohol and mead before, how you're taking in sort of a digestible amount of the unknown and chaos. So that's to me, that's why Odin drinks mead. Because he's able to digest that chaos, and that's all he wants, because he wants to learn as much as he possibly can. Maybe for Hymir that something similar, where this is one of the ways in which he gets what he needs to be able to rejuvenate himself and, get inspiration, that kind of thing. So this cup is very important, and it's, in some ways, it's almost like his will to keep living and keep going on. Like it's something that, we'll see, it's very important to him. And I would say it's something like that will to learn and to keep on growing as a person, or just, in life in general.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the whole thing with this cup, I think the implication is that it's something, it's a task, I think, that Hymir knows should not be able to be fulfilled, right? If it's just a glass cup, a stone would have broken it. Throwing it through a wall would have broken it. So yeah, it's like some kind of goal that almost seems unachievable by kind of traditional senses, something like that. Like this has got to be a special cup. You know what I mean? Definitely. There's more to it than it just being a cup. There's definitely something a little more symbolic. No, I definitely like where you're going with that. I mean, I don't have much more on that, to be honest, as far as just it being, a further test, maybe something that Hymir thinks Thor can't do by normal strength. You know what I mean? For sure. Yeah, no, there's something to it. I don't know enough about the importance of cups to, who we should talk to is Fjorn the Skald, because he knows all about the importance of ordinary items. Yeah, he's a good person to talk to. I think we're going to be interviewing him in our next episode. That's awesome. I wonder if I'll remember to ask him. Probably not, but I might have to talk to him later. This sounds good. We'll make a note of that here, though. That's no. We'll certainly, and we'll talk more about Thor, more about Fjorn afterwards. He's a good friend of the show. So he is. Okay, so should we move on and find out? Yes, let's move on and figure out what's going to happen. All right. Stanzas 30 to 32. Back to the poem. Till Hymir's pretty concubine told Thor a useful secret. Hit it on Hymir's head. That giant's skull is made of harder stuff than any cup. Thor stood up vigorously. He summoned all his godly strength. He left not a mark on that giant's head, but the wine cup broke into pieces. Hymir said, I know my loss is great when I see my cup fall broken at my knees. I know that I will never say again, the drinks are ready. That's just so sad.
He's a defeated giant. Like, you can tell he's been crushed. And well, one, I like that Thor had to get inspiration from an aspect of the feminine to figure out this problem, which is kind of exactly right. And he threw it against Hymir's head, which, now that I'm thinking about it more, it might actually, it kind of fits in even better with my idea that it's about learning and engaging with the world more, and that he's kind of broken Hymir's will to keep learning and that kind of thing. This is a total aside, but it's a funny story and kind of appropriate. My father, long ago, before I was born, he was in a car accident and put his head through the windshield. And he went to the doctor and said, "Oh, I've got a headache, but it's okay. I took some Tylenol, I'm fine." And they did some X-rays because he put his head through a windshield, and they wanted to see if he had a concussion, all that kind of stuff. And they came back and they said, like, "You're sure you've only got a headache?" And it's like, "Yeah, it's okay. Well, you've actually got like the thickest skull we've ever seen on a human." So yeah, when I saw that, I thought of my dad, and I thought that was pretty funny. So, but yeah, so, and you just have Hymir, like he's defeated. He knows that his cup is broken and that he's gonna be giving up his cauldron. So he's pretty bummed out. And the Thor of all people. I mean, he's killed all these giants, and now he's gonna have to give him his cauldron. It's a rough day to be Hymir. He's had a rough one.
He has, and I mean, as sad as he is, your story was fantastic, by the way. As sad as Hymir is, all of these challenges were put up by him, or they were at least kind of these unsaid challenges to Thor up till now. Now this is like an explicit test of Thor's strength, and he must have. I suppose he must have thought Thor wouldn't have been able to do it. You know what I mean? Well, like I said a little bit, but he must have thought that this was a test that Thor couldn't achieve, especially if he knew something like, well, bashing it on my head is like the only way to do it, or something like that. But Thor, he wins, right? He fulfills Hymir's challenge. And so, I mean, this is almost something, it says something like, this is the consequences of, making a big gamble where you could be at kind of personal loss, right? That's exactly what Hymir challenged Thor to do. He challenged Thor to do something that would be a significant personal loss to Hymir. And I mean, laying aside that he doesn't have the idea of getting another cup, which I think also speaks to it. Maybe it's a symbolic magic cup, where it's like the symbolic prototypical cup. And so Hymir's not allowed to have another one now that he's broken it, or something like that. But laying that all aside, it's like, Hymir offered up this challenge. Hymir not even offered it up. Hymir challenged Thor directly to do this. And since Thor was able to do it, he's sad now, but you know what? That's the consequences. And I mean, that's a great lesson, right? As far as I don't want to go too on the nose here, but not to challenge people to do things that would harm you. You know what I mean? I don't think that's too like on the nose on this. That can really be extended outward a lot, because it's like, don't tempt fate is almost like the generalized way to put it. You know what I mean? Where it's like, don't challenge the universe in general to knock you down. I'm struggling to find like a relatable example, but
No, I like that. Don't challenge fate toward the universe to knock you down, because it doesn't need an invitation. It's going to do it anyway, and usually like harshly and terribly. So like, why would you invite that kind of thing in? Like, there's a difference between going forth and facing it willingly and like as you're supposed to do, because then you can accept it and you can work with it, as opposed to kind of inviting it in. And well, it's like Cain, right? And Abel, when Cain goes to God and he's like, "Oh, why isn't anything going right for me?" And God says, "Well, you've invited all of this basically chaos. I can't remember the exact words, but basically chaos into your life and laid down with it like a dog in heat or something awful like that. So it's kind of the same thing. Like he was tempting fate, and that's why he wasn't achieving what he thought he deserved, whereas his brother Abel was, and became bitter about it. I would say that I'd say you're right about this. Hymir is kind of in that same boat as Cain, where he's invited chaos into his life in a way that's not helpful and reckless.
Definitely. And I do want to revisit, you touched on it a little bit, the idea that Thor got inspiration from the feminine. I just don't, I want to make sure we don't gloss over that, because that point is gigantic, because it's like Thor was just going about things his way. You know what I mean? He was just using brute strength. He was using the methods that ordered society has understood to work. But it takes that inspiration. And I always like opportunities to emphasize the positive aspect of the symbolic feminine, because that's just underemphasized in our society. And it's underemphasized to a fault, where it's like we only focus on the negative aspects of chaos. But the positive aspect is it's all this new innovation. It's the source of all the things that allow for creativity and allow for new ideas. And, you know, coming from women specifically, like a woman specifically in this story as a symbol of the feminine. And again, sort of our usual disclaimer, saying that symbolically the feminine is a symbol of chaos is not to say that all women are universally feminine and universally chaotic. It's a symbol. It's not applied to individual people. We just have to have that disclaimer there. But with that, it just underscores the idea that Thor needed that inspiration and innovation, and his ability to integrate that is what makes him the hero, because the hero does that. The hero takes new information, integrates it. He didn't come up with it on his own, but he did something about it. You know, he actually went and tried it. He actually went and tried this new idea, and it worked. He's the hero. And that's not to downplay the idea that the idea itself was not just as important. Having that idea itself in this situation, in this instance, that's key for the story to work. Without that new idea being there and being generated, Thor could not have completed this task. But he did something with it. He didn't come up with it, but he did something with it.
No, absolutely. He really showed how to learn and integrate new information and to be open to it. I can't help think though of how Odin would have played this situation, and I almost think, you know, he would have somehow caught 3 whales or whatever through some magic or underhandedness, and let Hymir eat until he was tired, and then when Hymir was sleeping, seduce his wife, and then, you know, get her to steal the cup and the cauldron. I don't know. Odin would have done it in a very underhanded way, whereas Thor, like, it was a very straightforward way, but he needed to learn that bit of information to be able to. Still, it was straightforward, but it had some nuance to it that he wouldn't have had before.
Right. The solution was still straightforward. I like that you mentioned that. Like, the solution was still hit the cup against something hard.
Yeah.
But he didn't know what would actually work, right? So it's, yeah, the whole situation is just funny. And yeah, Odin would have definitely done some seducing in this story. There's a pretty lady. Odin is definitely going to seduce the pretty lady.
Yeah, he couldn't help himself, really. I think he's got a problem. But
yeah, he might have a problem.
Yeah.
All right, should we move on?
I think so, yeah.
Stanzas 33 to 34. Back to the poem. The cauldron is yours, Thor and Tyr, if you can carry it out of my house. Tyr tried twice to lift it, but the cauldron remained unmoved. Thor, strong father of Mothi, took a turn. His feet broke through the floor while he lifted, but he lifted that cauldron over his head. Then the chains that held it broke and rattled at his heels.
So when I had mentioned earlier about Thor catching the world serpent on his fishing line and then putting his feet to the boat, and like you can actually find carved stones with that, like that exact thing on it with Thor's feet to the boat. We kind of have that motif here again, where his feet went through the floor lifting that cauldron. So I think we're just working with that motif. I think it's just to show that the cauldron is huge and sort of as an immense a situation as when he pulled up the serpent. Like, it takes that amount of strength to do it, and here Thor's doing it. Not only that, he's also pulling the chains out, and I'm imagining him doing it casually, which makes it more funny, where he's just like picking it up and putting it on his back, and he's like, okay, we're good to go. But he's now got the treasure from the unknown. He's got the reward for facing the unknown, the undifferentiated chaos that, in this case, Hymir would be the dragon, I guess. And now he's got access to the dragon's gold, the cauldron that will make all the beer in the world. And now it's time to go home. And the fact that Tyr wasn't necessarily worthy of it, he wasn't able to lift it, I think that's just because he didn't go through the same adventure that Thor did. He brought Thor to adventure's door, but it was Thor who went through all the tasks and proved himself worthy of it.
Yeah, and maybe to build on that too, because I agree, but to build on that a little bit, Thor is also the one who has that competency built up ahead of time, right? Which is really just to emphasize the idea that you need to work on yourself and be as good as you possibly can be, regardless of what the challenge is. If you're as good as you possibly can be, and in this case it means Thor is like, he's the one who is strong enough to fulfill this. Without that, he wouldn't have been able to do any of this. And there's some strong people, but I don't think there's anyone who, without training at all, can deadlift 900 pounds and then lift it over their head, right? And that's basically what Thor is doing. And this is just, to have a mental image, like deadlifting 900 pounds, that is like significant. That is ridiculous if someone can do that. And then, it's like inconceivable that someone could lift that over their head after, lifting that amount. You know what I mean? So
yeah, I'm trying to think of like what Olympic lifters do, because they basically do exactly that. They deadlift a certain amount of weight, then press it over their head. I don't think they're up at 900 pounds. Like the world's strongest man, I think his deadlift, I think it's Eddie Hall. No, it's a British guy. I can't think of.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you the specifics, but
his nickname is the Beast, and there's a good documentary. I don't know if it's still on Netflix right now, at least in Canada, but really interesting guy.
Well, maybe another more popular example these days is the Mountain from Game of Thrones.
For sure.
The real life guy.
Yeah, well, this guy that I'm thinking of, he can deadlift more than the Mountain. And he maxed out at I think 1,100 pounds or something. Like, it's insane. And to give you an idea, this is a huge feat of strength.
Monstrous feat of strength. And then the idea, going beyond that, right, is that, he lifts it over his head, and it's like he does it all casually. And my point was that I don't think anyone is capable of doing that without training. And
absolutely not.
Right. And so that's the point, is that Thor, maybe he is the son of Odin. He's this super strong guy. I think he's been doing strong things for a very long time in his life. He's trained for this. He's got the competency to be able to do this, right? This is the last test. You can have the cauldron if you can carry it out of my house. Thor just casually does it, right? And Tyr can't do it. If Tyr is like this god of war, right? He's got to be strong. He's got to be capable. He's got to be able to do a lot of things, but he's not strong enough to lift this cauldron. And, the message I take away from this is just to continually work on the things that I personally think are going to be beneficial to me and allow me to take on challenges that I conceivably could face. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily anticipate being in a situation exactly like this, but, I personally work on myself in a lot of different ways. And that's just something that this points to, is you have to have that competency and you have to work on it in order to be able to achieve these great things. And you know what? Maybe the other side of it too is you have to have worked on the specific thing that allows you to achieve this great task. Thor is the one who's up to it. Tyr is not. That's nothing against Tyr as a god, a symbol, whatever. That's just saying that Tyr hasn't done all of the prerequisite things and, you know, possibly the adventures and everything like that that would let him do this. Thor has. And so, I mean, if you're not able to achieve that one thing that you really, really want to, you know, maybe that's because your skill set isn't optimized, or even your raw talents kind of aren't there, like genetics, anything like that. You know, maybe that's not there. Like not everyone is going to be able to, well, very few people are going to be able to, you know, sprint 100 meters in less than 10 seconds, for example.
For sure. And actually, they've studied the genetics of Olympic athletes, and there's a difference from us mere mortals again. Like it's crazy to think, but there is a genetic difference between Olympians and just regular people, and these differences are what puts them in that category of sort of ultra human excellence in these in their areas of expertise kind of thing. So there is a genetic component. And I know that that's not a very popular thing to say because, you know, you can do anything you want to if you put your mind to it. But actually, there's a limit, and a hard genetic limit that you might just not be as good as someone else at something, no matter how hard you work. And, you know, they might not even have to work as hard as you at it and still be better, which is entirely frustrating and unfair. But, you know, that's what it is to be alive and be human, is that it's just not fair.
Right. But I mean, the solution to that to me is that you find the things that you are interested in, you're predisposed to, you're maybe even that you're good at naturally, but then to work at that and to try and be the best you possibly can. Because you know what? Why not try? Right.
Oh, absolutely. Like, so you're not Olympic caliber, whatever, that you could still get to a point where you're within like the top 5 percentile. I mean, it's like with Olympians, it's literally like a handful of people at that level. Like you could become extremely competent and just have, like, you know, Olympians better than you. Well, oh no, like a few people are better than you at this in the world. Like, that's still incredible.
Right. And I mean, that doesn't necessarily just have to be physical pursuits. That could be, you know, getting good at something that gives you a career, or, you know, a fulfilling hobby or whatever. But it's the combination of, you know, putting the work in and, you know, maybe being disposed to that or interested. I mean, like the whole concept of interest is so weird, right? Like how is one person interested in one thing and another person like completely thinks that's complete garbage to be interested in that, right? Like how does that even happen? I'm sure there's some explanation for it, but it's just so ephemeral, right? And you being interested in something, being good at something and working hard, like if you do that and maybe make a living or have a fulfilling hobby from it or whatever, like, I mean, I think that's the fulfillment of life in general. It gives it some meaning, and it also possibly allows you to take on challenges, right? And I mean, who knows what you're able to take on if you've put in the work and, you know, the whole culmination of all these different things, right? Like, I mean, I never thought my obscure random knowledge of some silly Finnish stuff would one day make it onto this show or whatever, right? Like turn into something real. Like that's something from like 10 years ago, which is actually a long time for me, right? And that's I would have never thought that would have kind of ever been useful. And now it's useful. Like, this is all just saying, go and learn and try and do the work and try and be good and try and be the best. Maybe you can't get there, but still try.
For sure. Joseph Campbell, who, I mean, big student of Carl Jung, and I don't think directly, but literally wrote the book on the hero's journey and mythology and all that kind of stuff, and the symbols that resonate and have resonated with people for generations and ages and through different civilizations. He's actually the one who came up with the idea of following your bliss. Like, find that, and he explains it's not this airy fairy, like, oh, follow your bliss. It's, find that thing that you're passionate about and then work at it and follow it and be disciplined about it and do everything you need to do to be the best that you can be at it, So it really shows you that everything we're talking about falls into that as well, that we're talking about things on sort of a macro level that, on the surface of it, this is a pretty, fun story about Thor, showing a giant, what for and tricking him and, showing up how strong he is, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, he went through all these ordeals and showed that he was worthy of it, of the cauldron, of the prize. And, it still works on both of those levels as well. It's just a fun story, but also there's lessons here. So I think it's one of the reasons why we do the podcast. There is value in looking at these stories seriously. And yeah, and we keep finding situations finding that quote from Joseph Campbell, but there's other things too, where it's just oh, geez, there's we're not just imagining these important things we're getting from these stories. It's sort of, it's been understood, or, I like to think of it, we're kind of like the opposite of conspiracy theories, where you find, with a conspiracy theory, you feel good because you know something that other people don't know. Whereas we feel good because we're learning something that everyone knows already. And it's just oh, now that explains that. Okay.
Oh yeah. Couldn't agree more. And yeah, you got it exactly right for kind of why we're doing this and for why this stuff is important. You know what I mean? And another aspect to it is that this is exactly how these lessons would have been imparted at the time of this writing, at the time of, the culture of the Norse, of the Vikings. This is how they would have understood these ideas. This is how they would have made sense of the world in this way. And it just shows the value in these old stories. It's still there.
I can definitely imagine, I'm going to need to pick some Viking names, but Bjorn taking his little son Ragnar out, and those were the first names that came to my head.
Well, I wonder why.
Yeah, right. But taking him out fishing for the first time and be oh, be careful, Ragnar. You don't want to pull out the Midgard serpent today, or maybe be hey, maybe if we do really good at fishing, maybe you'll get a nibble from the serpent today. That kind of thing. That's totally something that a dad would say to, or a funny uncle seeing them off. It's just because it'd be a part of their culture and a part of the game that they're playing, and something they could all reference at the same time and know exactly what they're talking about.
Definitely. And we have no shortage of great stories. Blockbuster movies being, they almost get to the level of creating new pantheons of gods that we can look up to and aspire to. Because first of all, Marvel movies, they've got Thor in it, right? I'm not going to say that they necessarily get him exactly true to the Old Norse stories, but they've got a literal god in there. And then they got all these other amazing characters that are doing these heroic things. We've got examples from the modern world here, but these are still valuable as well to see it and to see it from a different perspective. It's resurrecting this old wisdom and showing us that this has all been here for such a long time.
Absolutely. And I think that, at least with Marvel movies and DC movies, or any, there's actually been a fair amount of movies with ancient gods as well, dealing with Egypt, or the Greek ones or whatever. In our society, there actually does seem to be a hunger for these types of stories, and the addressing the meaning found within them that, we're not getting from reality TV or those other things. There does seem to be this hunger that for that meaning and sort of for that understanding that about life and of gods and heroes and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that's very human and we still have today.
Exactly. I think we could go on and on and on about all this, but Thor has got the cauldron. He's got what he came for, and Well, should we see where things go?
Absolutely.
Back to the poem. Stanzas 35 and 36. They walked a long time before Thor, son of Odin, turned around to take a look behind him. And he saw, coming from the rocky east, Hymir, with an army of giants coming at him, some with more than one head. Thor threw the cauldron down from his shoulders and stood ready to fight. He threw Mjolnir, his killing hammer, and he killed all those lava giants.
So this is Thor being Thor, like to the extreme, because what does Thor do? He kills giants. In some translations, where in here it says he threw Mjolnir, his killing hammer. I've seen other translations where it says Mjolnir murder eager, and I was like, that's hardcore. That's a killing hammer right there, right? And so I think it shows that Thor's doing a lot of things right here. Even though he's won his prize, he still has to make the journey back. And that's in the hero's journey, that's not insignificant. Like there is always the journey back from the unknown or the underworld to the tribe or home, bringing your prize. And there are a number of stories that have that part of the journey be actually where the hero loses. I'm thinking one of like Gilgamesh, where he has to wait for I think the sun to set on like the seventh day or something for his friend. I'm gonna get this wrong. Enkidu.
I think that's right.
I think that's right. Yeah. To be resurrected, and he doesn't make it yet because he has to stay up all those days or something like that. And he doesn't make it, even though he went to the underworld and got the prize. And it's like, okay, you're going to get it, but you actually kind of have to make this journey back. Or the one with, I can't think of it now, where it's a Greek hero. He plays music. Orpheus. He goes into Hades to get his wife back because she died on their wedding day from a snake bite. And the deal is he has to walk through Hades believing that his wife is following behind him. And she's like a shadow. But so he sees sort of like her shade or shadow. But then he sees her, then once he starts walking, he can't look back. Like if he looks back, it's all over. And then as he's coming out of the literal underworld, like he's coming out of a cave into the daylight, he looks back to grab her hand to like help her out of the cave, and she hasn't made it out yet, so she kind of like disintegrates before his eyes, and it's just this tragic tale. But all going to show that the journey back is actually like still part of the hero's journey and still somewhere where he can lose. And so we have Thor here doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing by being aware of the danger. Like he's not just resting on his laurels like, yeah, I've got it. He's like, no, I'm going to finish the job correctly. And it's a good thing because he had an army of giants coming for him, and not just like ice giants who are kind of, the gods have kind of a lukewarm relationship with them. Some of them, sometimes they marry frost giants. Sometimes they, he was just at Hymir's house and they were able to interact with each other without killing each other. So with the ice giants or the frost giants, there's kind of an uneasy relationship. But these ones are lava giants, and they're coming from like the really bad place where it's like malicious and evil, at least in our interpretation. It doesn't necessarily say that in the Eddas or anything like that, but our interpretation of Muspelheim is that it's a place of sort of malicious evil, not of just undifferentiated chaos.
Wanton destruction too.
Wanton destruction, exactly, yeah. Well, I don't know if you're going to go into, but like the placement of the wells.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to, but I could.
Well, might as well. I didn't want to step on any toes, but go ahead.
Well, no. So, I mean, my points on this were just like you mentioned here, and another example too from the Bible as well would be Lot's wife turning around.
That's right.
I forget when that story exactly was. I think that's still Genesis. I think.
Yeah, that's still Genesis. Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, that's right. So another example, just there. But yeah, like the other points I wanted to touch on here were Hymir. He doesn't violate hospitality while Thor is still in his hall, but then as soon as he's out, he can kind of go get Thor and take his revenge, get his cauldron back, right? But Thor proves he's up to that challenge. Those were really the points I was going to make. You covered it pretty well, but no, if you wanted to get into the wells and all that.
Well, I'm probably going to forget some of the names, but the wells, like there's one that shows up in Asgard that's known territory, and then is it Niflheim?
Yeah,
where there's another well, and that's I think where Odin is able to see because his eye is there.
That's the one in Jotunheim, which
Jotunheim, that's right.
Because that one it's not the super chaotic thing, like it's the unknown, but it's not like the deep chaos where all of these things are like can be horrible. Like all the possibly good things are there, but all the possibly very, very evil things are there, and you don't want your eye there.
Exactly. You don't want your eye in the spot where you could. I almost want to say you would be tempted to do those terrible things. One, you don't want to see it because it'd be a drag on your soul. Like it would be harmful to you to be exposed to that kind of suffering all the time, I think.
Well, don't people go insane, like literally insane when they're exposed to too much of I'm thinking of something specific here, but it's not like PTSD where it's like you have a specific trauma happen to you sort of thing. It's like you go insane because you're exposed to like so much suffering or something. Maybe at least that's like one possible. Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. One possible way of reacting to being exposed to tremendous suffering or tremendous chaos or whatever is to go insane.
Definitely. And there's like a soup of chemicals that your body releases when you're in those moments of like just craziness. And the chemicals that like allow you to do things like, lift a truck off a baby or whatever. But the point is that the chemicals are there to get you out of the situation into safety as quickly as possible with like in the safest way, right? If you constantly live in that situation, those chemicals literally break down your body and you will die. Like it's not like oh, maybe this will happen. It's like, no, these chemicals break down the body. And like, I think cortisone is a big one.
Cortisol.
Yeah. Cortisone is like the one that like helps with inflammation. Cortisol is the one that like, yeah, it's great in short bursts, but if it's a prolonged exposure and like, let's say you're living in an abusive situation, which is a good example of this, like cortisol is just going all the time, and it suppresses your immune system. It suppresses all the things that you can do when you're comfortable because it just wants you to get out of that situation. So yeah, your body's breaking down. Like it's terrible, like literally terrible.
Well, it's one of those things that stress in general, it doesn't even have to be, as dramatic as an abusive situation or something like that. It could be living from paycheck to paycheck with, like if you didn't get your next paycheck, maybe you would not be able to keep the roof over your head or not be able to feed your kids or something like that. Like that's constant stress. And that's a major reason why people living in poverty tend to stay in poverty and live shorter lives. It's not even just because there's a tendency towards abuse of alcohol or tobacco or things like that. I mean, in a lot of ways, those tend to be kind of numbing agents. And there's other sociological arguments for kind of why this all is. And I'm not an expert in that, and I'm not an expert in anything, but I'm not an expert in that, definitely. But so I won't discuss that. But a major thing for why people in that situation can tend to stay in that situation is because it literally shortens your life to be in a constant state of stress and having cortisol. And I'm sure there's others that just drag you right down and you can never escape out of it. And I mean, it's a tough situation. It's tough to know that there are people out there living like this. A lot of people living like this with probably in a lot of cases very little hope of getting out of that situation. And it's a societal problem that you know, it'd be a good thing if society could solve that, and well, as a start, not have as many people living in that situation.
For sure. And make it easier to get out of that situation, so that, like, we've talked about this, and it's not it's kind of related, but like I think it's the Pareto principle, where you have people piling up at zero, right? Well, that's where the stress is. That's where where you're going to have your life shortened. So if you could get more people away from zero, or make it easier to climb out of zero, like that would be a vast improvement for society. And
yeah, it's not a good thing for people to pile up there, and for the proportion to be increasing. That's not a good thing.
No.
If the proportion was at least decreasing of the number of people at zero, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the number of people who are doing like really successfully is going to change necessarily. Like the Pareto principle essentially says that there's always going to be kind of a fixed number of people doing like very, very, very well, but that those people kind of at that high end of the distribution is going to change. Like the 1%, the constantly what's the word, demonized 1% is not always the same people. It can seem like it's always the same people, but it is actually like a changing number, you know, because people who have had success don't necessarily maintain that success, especially across generations, and that allows for opportunities for people to succeed. But invariably, that's people who are not at zero and not close to zero either. And so the idea is just that, you know, the system of organizing the world around principles of capitalism and things like that, you know, it's resulted in a lot of people being taken out of poverty and a lot of growth, a lot of economic growth, a lot of new technologies and innovation. But you still got people at zero. And probably in a lot of cases, I believe on a macro level as a whole, we are alleviating extreme poverty. We are doing that. Poverty, especially extreme poverty, has been cut by drastic amounts in the last even 20 years. But on a local level, certainly there are a lot of people piling up at zero. And you know, that's something that's not good. And, you know, making changes to society in order so that doesn't happen would be a good thing for these individual people and for society, because then they actually can start contributing, as opposed to, well, and I mean, that's not to say someone who's working like 2 jobs that aren't going anywhere, that's not still a service to society, but they're not able to get themselves out. And yeah, just all these things, right? For
sure. And that's not to say we have any solutions either, because I don't think we do, but it's just, yeah. Piling up at zero is not good. And, you know, I think safe to say we would like people to be able to do well. So surely there's something we can do to continue to alleviate that. And yeah, so
ways to improve society, right? I mean, it really is just to say that for all of the good things that we have built upon in the last, say, 100 years or so, or maybe slightly longer than that, or if you want to extend it all the way, all of the good things across time, across society still has not made the world perfect. And so there's still ways to change and still ways to grow and build on it. But if you were to, you know, just throw society away completely, that would probably result in a lot more people, certainly in the short term, but also probably the long term, because we've been trying to figure out this whole problem of how to organize society for as long as society has existed. You know, you throw that all away, and what do you get? You get probably a lot of people in a bad spot. So,
oh, definitely. No, it'd be far worse without, like, it'd be throwing, you know, the baby out with the bathwater, but in a much more, I would actually say, much more dramatic way, where you'd have a lot more people falling off and then landing in zero and then never getting out.
Yeah, probably a lot of people dying too.
Lots of people dying.
That really all is just to say, because we've gone on quite the tangent here, is that you know this says that there are things we can do to improve, and that's a good thing
for sure. And to be aware that after you get the prize, and I think this actually applies too, is that you still have to be on your guard and to look for things that might derail you. So in this case, in society's case, it's making sure that, you know, we've got many prizes that we've attained throughout the years, but we still haven't brought it back for everyone, kind of thing. So there's still things to be wary of.
Definitely. And that ties it back in really, really well. Thor has not only seen the danger coming up behind him, but dealt with it, because Thor is the hero. Thor is competent, and Thor just is very good at killing giants.
That's what he does.
Absolutely. So shall we take this on home? Not quite to the end, but
yeah, no, let's go on.
All right, this will be stanzas 37 and 38. Back to the poem. They didn't walk long before Thor, son of Odin, saw before him one of his goats, half dead. The goat was walking with a lame leg, and this was caused by lie-telling Loki. But audience, you have heard all this. This story is often told among the stories of the gods. It's told how Thor was paid back by the lava giant Egil. Thor took both his children.
So you can tell the story's winding up, and right at the beginning, when he went to Egil's house and left his goats there, and now comes back and sees his goat with the lame leg. That's referring to a story where Loki and Thor go out for an adventure, and they meet, and they're calling him Egil. I'm not sure if in the story it's references Egil, but here it is. And so they meet a family who's fairly poor. They don't have meat for their guests, Loki and Thor. So Thor kills his two goats because he can resurrect them, no problem. And so they eat the goat meat, and they say, okay, Thor says to the family, eat to your heart's content, but don't crack the bones and eat the marrow. But then Loki convinces the boy to eat the marrow because it's the most delicious part. And so he cracks the bone, eats the marrow. And then when Thor goes to resurrect his goats again, his poor goat has a bad leg. And then they take the children on, sort of as servants in reparation for losing the livestock. And then they go on another grand adventure, really. Like it's this one, Thor getting his hammer back, and the one that they're referencing here are probably like the three big adventures that Thor goes on, and Loki's involved in two of them. So,
or three if you
or three if you include this one.
Well, and I mean they certainly say that it's Loki's fault here.
For sure, and it also gives them a reason for why they were at Egil's house traveling, right? So in some ways it's kind of a prequel to this, but in the other story it's not quite a prequel because it's kind of interwoven into it. We're trying to make these make sense chronologically, and it's very hard to do, but
there's almost no point. But
there's no point, yeah. But it's neat to see how they're referenced with each other, and that the audience already knows the story, because we've said before, like, a lot of this is assumed knowledge that the audiences would have heard these stories many times, and we actually have like a mention of that here where, yeah, you guys know this story, and so they're not going to retell it here.
No, exactly, which is, good of you to recap that a little bit. And if you followed along with us, from the beginning almost here, you'll know that this is one of my favorite stories because it's a remnant of one of the oldest religious what's the word I'm looking for? It's a remnant of one of the oldest structures of religion that we have knowledge of, and this comes from before even agriculture would have been discovered, which is a big deal, right? Like, if it's before agriculture, it's before the discovery of cyclical time, it's before the discovery of, it's before societies would have been sedentary, essentially, settled down with agriculture, with their herds of cattle and things like that, which is the type of society that they have here. But before that, it was a hunting society. And there was a big deal about the concept of the Lord of Wild Beasts. Mircea Eliade goes into great detail about this, especially in his History of Religious Ideas books. But the general idea is that the people would acknowledge the existence of this Lord of Wild Beasts as sort of being an influence on whether they could successfully achieve a hunt, whether they could get an animal to kill and to eat. And the idea is that they would take, and we have evidence of this, and this is why this was sort of hypothesized, is that these cultures, they would take the long bones of the animal, which would be the legs, the femurs in that, and the skulls, which include the most valuable, like the brain. The idea is that the brain itself even would not be eaten. We have no idea of knowing that for 100% sure, but the marrow wouldn't have been cracked, the marrow wouldn't have been eaten, and the brain wouldn't have been eaten. These are great, like calorie-rich, fatty things, right? Would have been very good for, the society to be able to do that. But they leave that in these sacred places, and the idea is that these animals would get resurrected so that they could hunt them again. And this story of Thor and his goats is actually used as an example of why we know that concept as fleshed out as we do. And so the fact that this is just a remnant of that ancient model, and it's woven into these heroic stories, it's like, this is so old. This is such an ancient thing, such an ancient idea. And I mean, it'd be considered primitive if you were to think about it today, like, oh, saving the bones of the animal so it will resurrect. Well, that's not how it works. But you know what? That's the way they made sense of the world, and that's the way that they respected the animals that they were killing. They didn't want to hunt them into extinction. They wanted to have more for the future, and that was their way of expressing that and of honoring that. And this story is one of my favorites for that reason.
Absolutely. No, it's awesome to see that. And I would imagine at the time that idea, like if you were hearing this story, back in the day, at the time, that idea would have been old then. Like it's hard to really express how old that idea is, because, well, in here, it's kind of a plot device. Like the idea has already kind of, I don't want to say degraded, but like the importance of it has kind of fallen away. Like it's now it is a plot device for the Norse, and I mean the Norse stories are already old, at least to us. So think of how old that idea is. Like it's mind-boggling.
I would definitely figure that they wouldn't have understood the significance of the story in the same way as 10,000 years before, when that would have been the type of culture.
For sure.
No, it's a fantastic story and kind of ties things back together. And should we now take it all on?
Yes, let's take it on home.
Stanza 39. Back to the poem. Then Thor, mightiest of gods, returned to Asgard with the cauldron of Hymir. And now the gods drink good beer every winter's day in Aegir's hall.
That to me seems like the Viking way of just saying they lived happily ever after. They've got beer in the winter. Like, hey, that's not too bad, So, it's the conclusion of the prototypical adventure hero story where Thor has, they needed something. Thor, the hero, went out into the unknown, got the treasure, which is the cauldron, made the journey back, and then was able to give it to his family, his tribe, his people, and they're able to integrate it into their lives. And now they're benefiting from it by having good beer to drink every winter's day in Aegir's hall. So yeah, it puts a nice bow on the story, and it shows that these, I guess that the blueprint for these stories has been developing for a long, long time. And that a lot of our stories, even back then, shared the same sort of main beats to the story that it went through. And it's just it's one of those like great stories about Thor where you can see why people would love him. Like, he brought beer to the people, and he's fighting giants and he's having a good time, and it's we still have these types of stories today. Like, it hasn't gone away at all.
Exactly. He achieved the mission and he brought back benefit to his society. And you know what? Having that blueprint is so valuable because it says this is how you can be universally beloved by everyone around you, is to go and do these things, do these unique things that bring back benefit to society, going out into the unknown, getting the gold of the dragon, right? That's why these stories exist. They wouldn't exist if there wasn't some benefit to knowing this is a good thing to do. You know what I mean? Like, these wouldn't have become these heroic tales, these mythological tales over time, over such a long period of time, if it wasn't beneficial for, the youth of society to understand that this is how you achieve great things. And, if you're faced with challenges, this is how you deal with it. This is why this stuff is valuable.
Absolutely.
And with that has been Hymiskvida, the fetching of the cauldron. And it's a fantastic story of Thor going out and encountering the unknown, getting the prize at the end and bringing it back to his tribe. And everyone lives happily ever after, as you said.
Well, I mean, the gods, not the giants. The suffering for them was terrible because Thor killed them all. But I mean, we're more fans of the gods, so. Right.
And obviously everything's, going to fall apart and die at Ragnarok. So,
it's really like in the swirling vortex of terribleness of life, here's a bright point that you can cling to as everything swirls down the drain. This took a nice turn, eh? But no, it's a fun story, and they live happily ever after for the most part.
For the time being.
Yeah.
All right, and I guess with that's it for us for today. But barring our usual acknowledgments and all that. And so here again is our translation of the Poetic Edda, translated by Jackson Crawford. And again, it's as you've just heard, it's a very readable, easy to follow along with, easy to understand, and it's a great translation. We'll post a link to Amazon if you want to purchase it and follow along with us, which we highly encourage. So thank you again to Jackson Crawford and to Hackett Publishing for allowing us to use it. And I think what I'll also mention here as well is just how to get a hold of us on social media. We really, really love it whenever anyone gets in touch with us and gives us a comment or anything like that. We love having conversations about this stuff. And of course, it's the best way for you to stay up to date with everything that we are doing, which includes, new episodes and, all the clips that we're putting out on our YouTube channel. So on Facebook, we're facebook.com/Northern Myths. On Twitter, we are @Northern Myths. On Instagram, we are Northern Myths Podcast. And of course, we've also got our YouTube channel, so Northern Myths Podcast for that. And there's where we post all of our podcasts on there as a video as well, if you'd like to see us talking about all this instead of just listening to it. And we also post clips of all of our episodes that we find interesting and are a little easier to digest than these 2 to 3 hour episodes sort of thing here. So that's what we're doing there. And we always appreciate if you'd like the show, write us a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. If you're on there, that's a big help to us. Sharing on social media, always appreciate that. And, if you want to take a look at our YouTube channel, we definitely appreciate a subscribe and checking out a few of our videos there. So, yeah, that's kind of it for that. And we do want to mention some pretty cool things, community things that we've been kind of getting involved with there. We've really liked getting in touch with a lot of other podcasters and, people on Twitter and things like that. One example is Going Viking, @GoingViking on Twitter. That page has been doing a really good job of promoting a lot of different podcasters, and also brands and other people kind of doing things with a Viking theme like we kind of are here. So check them out. The Going Viking page there @Going Viking on Twitter, and other podcasters that we just like to acknowledge that have we've made friends with along the way here and are doing similar and interesting things that you might enjoy. So first, there's Noah Tessner's History of Vikings. So on Twitter, he's at History of Viking, and he was a big supporter of ours kind of early on. He was our, he had us on our show, and we had him on ours, and we owe a fair bit to him, kind of helping us as we were getting started with podcasting in general. So definitely check him out. He's got a lot of great interviews with really, really interesting people. Then there's also Fjorn's Hall by Fjorn the Skald. He's another really good friend of the show, and he's actually going to be our next episode. We're interviewing him right after this. So yeah, check him out. His podcast is really interesting. Goes through some more kind of obscure stories that often aren't as well known, and so that's really good and really, really valuable, really interesting there. And he's also got a fantastic blog and website with a lot of great information about Norse mythology in general. So he's at Fjorn the Skald. If I'm misremembering that, all these links will be in our descriptions and show notes and all that. And then two others that we really like and enjoy are the Viking Age podcast and Saga Thing. So both of them have been around for quite a while here, and they've got a lot of great content about the Viking Age, and Saga Thing covers a lot of the sagas, the Icelandic sagas, and sort of reviews them. They're really fantastic. So we'll post links to them as well. And the last one we'll mention here as well is the not a podcast, but they're a really cool little brand of Viking themed products, specifically beard products. So there's the Viking Beard Company. They're from England, actually from York, I believe, which is kind of the center of Viking culture in the United Kingdom. And they certainly take their Viking connection and roots very seriously. And they've got some fantastic products. So check them out. We'll post a link to them as well. They only ship currently to the UK and EU. So if you're from there, check them out. They got a lot of great products, and they're not all that expensive either. But then if you're from, the rest of the world here, contact them on social media and let them know you'd like to, maybe try out their products someday. And, maybe one day they'll start shipping more abroad to, say, the US, Canada, and even more internationally. So, we don't want to, annoy them too much, but if you're interested in taking a look at their products, they've got some great stuff going on. So check them out as well. And with that, I think that's everything, unless I'm forgetting anything, Dan.
Well, Luke, there is one more thing, and it's the most important thing, and that's for us to go forth and find the myth you're living.
This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thanks for listening.